All right, everybody, welcome to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm your host, Scott Horton. Keep all the archives for you at weekendinterviewshow.com, and also you can sign up for the podcast there. More and more people are signing up for the podcast, get automatic downloads of all the radio shows for free, of course. Weekendinterviewshow.com. Also, I write for antiwar.com. You can most often find me at the blog up there. And I want to give a real quick plug to Derek's Martial Arts Gym, teaching Muay Thai and Kali down there off of Alpine and South Congress. The website is dmag.com for Derek's Martial Arts Gym. Now, I woke up this morning and I felt the dark side of the force, and I wasn't sure what it was. Yesterday was a pretty good day. We got at least one neocon was indicted. And then I turned on the TV. It turns out Bill Clinton is in town, which explains the shadow, even though the sun is shining brightly here in Austin, Texas. And one more thing real quick, I would like to go ahead, and I hate to do this. I feel terrible doing it, but I'm going to go ahead and ask for donations. I need them. You can go to weekendinterviewshow.com and click on the big link up at the top if you want to help donate and keep the Weekend Interview Show going strong. Got a great show lined up for you today. First hour, we have Philip Giraldi and Bob Dreyfuss to discuss the indictment yesterday and perhaps the origin of the Niger uranium forgeries. And then in the second hour, we'll be talking again with Scott Horton, not myself, but in fact the international human rights lawyer. So stay tuned for that. Also, I probably shouldn't even say it, but there's a slight chance that we'll get to talk to Cindy Sheehan in the last half hour. Although I wouldn't count on it. I'm trying to get that arranged. Okay, now, so catch up. Basic outline of what's going on here. Scooter Libby was indicted yesterday of 5 different counts, perjury, making false statements, and obstruction of justice. He is the vice president's chief of staff and also apparently has a job working, or did have a job working on the president's staff as well. He has now resigned. And what I have been trying to impart to my audience on this show, and what you're going to learn today, is that all of the different scandals of the Bush administration are one big scandal. That is the leaking of the name of Valerie Plame. That is the forging of the Niger uranium documents in the first place that got her and her husband in so much trouble. The AIPAC spy ring, including Larry Franklin, who has already pled guilty, a former Iran analyst at the Pentagon. And the war itself and who lied us into it is all one big scandal. And it was summed up last week fairly well, I think, by Larry Wilkerson, who was Colin Powell's chief of staff for more than a decade. And he gave a speech last week, I believe, at the New America Foundation, where he talked about the Cheney cabal that had seized the government. And, of course, many of us are familiar with the fact that Colin Powell told Bob Woodward that Fife had set up a Gestapo office and created a separate government, that Cheney, Rumsfeld, and the neocons had created a separate government after September 11th. And some of these neocons whose names you need to be familiar with: Wolfowitz, Douglas Fife, Abram Shulsky, David Woomser, Scooter Libby, John Hanna, Stephen Hadley, Elliot Abrams, Bill Luty, Michael Ledeen, Larry Franklin, guilty, Michael Rubin, and somewhat John Bolton. All right, my friends, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I am Scott Horton, and my guests this hour are Philip Giraldi and Bob Dreyfuss. Phil Giraldi is a former CIA and DIA counterterrorism officer. He's a partner in Canestraro Associates, and he writes a deep background for the American Conservative magazine. He has an article up on the American Conservative website right now. It's amconmag.com, called Forging the Case for War. It is also highlighted in the Viewpoint section at antiwar.com. Bob Dreyfuss is a freelance reporter, is a regular contributor to The Nation, Mother Jones, The American Prospect, Tom Paine, and Rolling Stone. He's the author of the new book, Devil's Game: How the United States Helped Unleash Fundamentalist Islam. His latest article on the neocon Gate scandal is Keep Investigating Fits, that he wrote for TomPaine.com. I'd like to welcome you both back to the Weekend Interview Show.
Hello. Yeah, thanks, Scott.
It's great to have you guys back on here. And if we can, I guess, basically just start, everybody knows, hopefully, that yesterday Dick Cheney's chief of staff, Scooter Libby, was indicted on 5 counts related although not directly involving, but related to the leaking of the name Valerie Plame, the covert CIA operative, apparently as revenge for her husband blowing the whistle on Dick Cheney and the lies that led us to war. Many people, I think, were expecting a few more presents under their Fitzmas tree than just one person indicted yesterday. So I guess I'd like to start with just getting you guys' initial reactions to what happened yesterday and whether you have an optimistic or pessimistic viewpoint on the Fitzgerald investigation from here on out. Bob?
Well, you know, it's certainly good news that Fitzgerald made as much progress as he announced yesterday. I think the fact that they've indicted a senior White House official who's now going to be brought to trial is very important news. And not only has it led to his resignation, but I think it's really rocked all of Washington. It's certainly discredited, undermined the credibility of the Bush White House and has further, I think, weakened the, whatever remaining political capital the president had for the rest of his agenda for the next 3 or 3.5 years. And, of course, that includes his foreign policy agenda. So the whole episode, I think, has greatly weakened the Bush administration and has made it a lot more difficult for them to maneuver, I think. The second part, I guess, of what I would say is we don't know, what else there is to come. As you outlined at the top of your program, there's 8 or 9 different topics that each of which could merit its own prosecutor, or Fitzgerald could expand his investigation just the way Ken Starr did. If you remember, Ken Starr was assigned to investigate a Philly real estate deal in Arkansas called Whitewater that took place years before. And instead of stopping at that, which turned out to be a complete and utter non-scandal, he started investigating Travelgate and Filegate and Vince Foster Gate and the lunatics who thought Vince Foster, was murdered. And
Philip Giraldi, do you think that's likely to happen, that the Fitzgerald investigation will end up expanding in the way that the Ken Starr investigation did?
No, I don't think it's likely at all. I agree with most of what Bob said, and my spin on it would be that you have to look at this as a narrowly focused legal issue. And I think Fitzgerald made it very clear that in this case, the outing of the CIA names is very, very hard to prove because you have to prove motive and a lot of other things.
Right.
So I think what Fitzgerald was saying was that he took what he could get here, and that's exactly what he did. And I think he also sent the message very clearly that he's not interested in looking at the Iraq War as an issue. That said, I do hope that there are going to be other people that are going to go down for this. It's clear from what was in the press today that Karl Rove is still being investigated. So that would be a big plus. And I've heard in Washington from a lot of people that Stephen Hadley is being looked at very closely also. So these are people who were architects of the war, and even though they were only looking at the outing of a CIA officer, we all know that the real story goes back to the justification for the war and the forgery of documents, but that's not going to come out of this inquiry.
So the question is, I guess, then what it would take to get a different inquiry. Seems like if they wanted to, they could go ahead and merge the McNulty and Fitzgerald investigations together as it is, right?
Well, McNulty has been appointed a deputy attorney general now, so he's kind of out of the loop. Plus, he's kind of a Republican loyalist anyway, and Franklin has pleaded guilty. So, there are kind of limits on how far that one can go.
So McNulty will not be in charge of prosecuting Rosen and Weissman anymore?
No, he will not be.
Okay.
Somebody else will have to be appointed. And I think there are kind of limits to how far this can go in political terms. But that said, if the underpinning of the war really becomes an issue here in the media, it's quite possible that Congress and other groups will pick up the ball on this.
Well, we might have to wait another year. After all, the Congress already promised to investigate this and then stopped, right?
Right.
Well, Well, see, I think it's more than just Democrat versus Republican, though. Some of the most important players right now in this incipient rebellion that's going on in Washington are the realist Republicans.
You're speaking of Wilson and Scowcroft, for example.
Yeah. I mean, if you saw what Colin Powell's former aide Wilkerson was saying about the Cheney cabal, and it goes beyond that. I think there are some people, Senate Republicans, people like John Warner and Chuck Hagel and so forth, people in that circle who are certainly not part of any ideological faction in the far right of the Republican Party, who want to restrain the administration. And there are a lot of people in the bureaucracies, in the Pentagon, in the CIA, in the State Department, career officers, people who've been troubled for the last 4 years by the direction that Bush has taken. So there's a coalition that's emerging against Bush that has nothing to do with Democrat versus Republican. And in that sense, if we don't want to wait, at least I don't, until 2009 to see if a sane Republican or some sane Democrat gets elected. Bush is going to be in office for 3.5 more years. But if enough political pressure can develop to get rid of Cheney, and of course there's been some wild speculation about him resigning, and Rumsfeld is another candidate to say, okay, I give up. Then if you could get rid of Cheney and Rumsfeld, then really you'd have a brand new Bush administration.
Maybe bring in his father's guys, James Baker and those guys, to finish out the rest of the term, you think?
Well, there's 100 people you could name to bring in, and it's pretty hard to think of anybody worse. I mean, I've heard talk about Lindsey Graham being named vice president, senator from South Carolina. There's other people. I mean, it just means bringing in some people who are willing to concentrate on other issues rather than foreign adventures, who could stabilize the thing and sort of take away some of the establishment pressure that's building up on Bush.
Well, and I think that was really the hope that a lot of people were putting on Fitzgerald, that he would go ahead and, there have been so many leaks about him expanding his investigation into the forgeries themselves and that kind of thing. A lot of people were sort of hoping that Fitzgerald would go ahead through the courts and purge the neocons in a way that we can't seem to do at the polling place. I, for one, feel very let down. I was expecting at least 3 or 4 indictments. And, like Phil, when you talk about Stephen Hadley, whatever his role may have been in the leaking of Plain's name, we're now finding out more and more about his role in the forgeries themselves. And as you said, what we already know, which is this is all one big criminal conspiracy to lie us into war, in which many separate federal offenses were committed in the act.
Yeah, that's right. And I think the thing you have to realize here is that, for me, it seems that the issue is now becoming, we know that false intelligence was what fed this war frenzy, and most of this false intelligence went, as Wilkerson said this week, went through channels that avoided the regular policy-making channels. And clearly now it's evident that a lot of this stuff wound up in Hadley's hands and in the vice president's office. Now, to me, the other question that's kind of is begging here is that where do you draw the line on using fake intelligence and cross that line in terms of inventing it yourself? If you think back about 2 years ago, the Defense Department was planning on setting up a disinformation agency which was going to feed false information to overseas press outlets.
Right, the Office of Strategic Influence.
Right, exactly. So this is not such a wild concept that you make up the information to support the policies that you want to pursue. And I suspect that the making up of information was really what the administration was going after Wilson about, because he was touching a very sensitive nerve.
Right, because basically this was a big psyop against us. The American people.
Exactly.
All right, everybody. I'm talking with Philip Giraldi, former CIA man, writes for the American Conservative magazine, and Bob Dreyfuss, one of the greatest reporters in the world, writes for Tom Paine and The Nation, etc. And we will be right back on the Weekend Interview Show. Hey everybody, I'm Scott Horton, and this is the Weekend Interview Show. I'm talking with Philip Giraldi from the American Conservative magazine and Bob Dreyfuss from TomPaine.com. And I want to go ahead and recommend a few more footnotes here for people who are interested in learning about the neoconservatives and their crime ring and their terrible war. First at the top of the list, of course, is antiwar.com, and particularly the writings of our head writer, Justin Raimondo, the War and Peace blog by Laura Rosen, and the Talking Points memo by Joshua Micah Marshall are both great. Richard Sale, formerly of UPI, has written some great stuff. Seymour Hersh in The New Yorker, Jim Loeb for the Interpress Service, and, of course, Julian Borger at The Guardian. And I don't mean to sell my two guests short. Phil Giraldi and Bob Dreyfuss both have written a lot of great stuff about the neoconservative takeover of this government. And I want to go ahead and get confusing here, guys. If you don't mind, let's go ahead through the nuts and bolts and see if we can't figure out who forged these Niger uranium documents in the first place. Is that okay with you guys?
Sure.
You can try.
All right. Let's see if we can go ahead and at least get as confused as possible, if not get it all straightened out at the end. First of all, Phil, who did the break-in at the Niger embassy in Rome in January of 2001? Do you know?
Well, it clearly was carried out by the Italian intelligence service, SISMI, but I'd have to qualify that. It may have been a rogue element in the organization. The story is very complicated, and we would be here for another half hour just trying to get through that part of it. But suffice it to say, the documents wound up in the hands of the Italian intelligence service, SISMI.
Right, and it seems, especially reading Joshua Marshall's articles about this, it's very confusing. It seems sort of like wherever they came from originally, it seemed like they were being funneled around in a circle between people inside the Niger embassy and SISMI, I guess sort of just laundering the documents so that it would be too difficult for us to finally ever figure out where exactly they came from in the first place, right?
Well, I think that might be a story, actually. I think that the line of having obtained these documents might be a lot more direct. But that's not important to the story, I don't think. What is important to the story is that we know these documents basically came up in Rome. They were forged in Rome. The Italian intelligence service tried to sell this information, I don't mean for cash, but tried to gain influence with the Bush administration by producing a report based on these documents and other documents. And this report was twice looked at by CIA and State Department and rejected as being unsubstantiated. And then these documents again surfaced with the neoconservatives, particularly Michael Ledeen, working for the Office of Special Plans, doing an end run on the established intelligence vetting procedures and getting this stuff to Hadley into the Vice President's office. And
we know now at this point that regardless of all the stories of, well, the UK has their own independently verified intelligence, whatever, we know now that all the intelligence that ever said Saddam Hussein was trying to buy uranium from Niger all came from these forged documents. Even if it wasn't the documents themselves, it was word-for-word transcriptions of the forged documents, right?
That's pretty much true.
Okay, now, so basically a year after the break-in or so, February of 2002 is when the CIA, at Dick Cheney's request, sent this guy Joseph Wilson, the former ambassador, to investigate. And he came back, and I guess we're learning now he gave a report to the CIA and to something called WINPAC, the CIA's Weapons Intelligence Non-Proliferation and Arm Control Group, that he gave them the briefing saying that this information was faulty?
Yes.
And, Bob, you've written something interesting about WINPAC lately. Help me connect the dots here.
Well, inside the CIA, there was a great deal of skepticism about the whole project to go to war in Iraq. And there were lots and lots of people who felt, first of all, that Iraq wasn't a threat to the United States, and then second, who believed that the the allegations about Iraq's connections to al-Qaeda were silly, and that the allegations that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction were wrong or exaggerated. But and especially the Near East division at the CIA was, I think, on much more solid ground during all of this pre-war debate. But WinPAC was, I think, much more leaning in the direction of supporting the Bush administration's venture, and some of its top people, including Alan Foley, seem to have, been much more willing to bend the rules about what valid intelligence is supposed to look like to justify the war project. So, and I wrote about this in a piece I just did for the American Prospect on Porter Goss's tenure at the CIA, which took a look somewhat, backward too, in terms of the roots of this very bitter competition between the CIA and the White House in the years before the war.
So when the CIA wasn't really going along, they had set up the Office of Special Plans at the Pentagon, and they set up the White House Iraq Group in Cheney's office as well. And these are, Phil, the kind of the back channel circles that you're referring to, where the documents went through them and around the CIA because the neocons were sick and tired of the CIA debunking their lies. Is that it?
Well, the thing is that there were thousands and thousands of bits of intelligence that went into falsifying the case for war, and one of them was the Niger documents.
Right.
And that became important because of what later happened with Wilson blowing the whistle, and then the White House trying to shoot him down.
Right, and also
that could have happened with 100 other pieces of sort of weak or bad intelligence.
All right, we'll be right back, everybody, with Phil Giraldi and Bob Dreyfuss. Welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton. I'm talking with Philip Giraldi from the American Conservative magazine, and Bob Dreyfuss writes for the American Prospect, TomPaine.com, The Nation, and many others. And we're talking about Neocon Gate, and more specifically, the Niger uranium forgeries. Now, Phil, when you and I talked before, you told me that the word was, and you told me in a roundabout way, that word was in entire intelligence circles that Michael Ledeen arranged the forging of the documents, and that a couple of former CIA guys allied with him were the principal forgers. You also said that there was reason to believe that the operation was paid for by Chalabi and the Iraqi National Congress, and that these guys got paid in foreign accounts. And last I heard from you on this, there was a money trail to follow, and you thought Patrick Fitzgerald had already followed it.
Well, the evidence is that Patrick Fitzgerald has obtained a lot of information from the Italian government, because the Italian government has investigated this whole thing. The last time I spoke to you, I didn't say that these guys were definitely the forgers. I said that the word was that there was a suspicion they might be. There was a lot of Italian press coverage over this past week on the issue of the forgeries. And what the Italian investigation reveals very clearly is that Ledeen in particular was a conduit for these documents getting to the upper level of the U.S. administration. Ledeen was also working at the Office of Special Plans in the Pentagon with a couple of former senior CIA people who were also working. All these people wore two hats. They were working as consultants also with the Iraqi National Congress, and they were getting paid for that activity. That's what I was referring to.
I see.
And some of this money, of course, was paid was paid overseas.
Now, as Ledeen is mentioned in the Italian La Repubblica articles, they're basically only talking about him later on the receiving end in that context, right? They're not talking about him as the origin, are they?
No, they're talking about him as being the implementer for these documents getting from Italy to Washington.
Right.
That's what they were able to come up with. But that said, I've heard from a number of sources that there is an Italian parliamentary investigation document that is in the hands of Fitzgerald and McNulty, and also that the head of the Italian service, Niccolo Polari, is going to be talking to the Italian Parliament this coming Friday.
Right, and in fact, Justin Raimondo broke that story on antiwar.com, where he named, I must presume, the two former CIA guys as Alan Wolf and a guy named Dwayne Claridge. And then I guess it was 2 days later, Chris Matthews on Hardball confirmed that Fitzgerald had indeed gone to the Italian embassy to get their report. And then Richard Sale, who I'm not sure why he doesn't work for UPI anymore. I know he's done some really great work in the past. He put a blog entry up in this last week on a blog called Sic Semper Tyrannis, where he repeats the name Claridge in there as one of the people that Fitzgerald may be looking at. So I wonder, it's too bad all these great articles all come from anonymous sources, and we never can really get to the bottom of who knows who these guys are. What role they may have played exactly in this.
Well, I think it's important to emphasize, too, that, there was a story in the New York Times in the last day or two that said that the FBI has spent 2 years trying to find out who forged these documents and apparently hasn't conclusively, come to a result yet.
Right.
I'm not sure it matters who forged them. What's important here, as I was saying a little while ago, is that there were hundreds of bad pieces of intelligence that were used to justify this war. The CIA gets thousands and thousands of bad pieces of intelligence every day. People lie to them, sources lie, agents lie, everything happens. Foreign agents lie. So it's the job of intelligence professionals to sort out forged documents and lies and so forth to come up with real intelligence. That's what the intelligence process is. What happened in this case is that the people who wanted to go to war simply picked up all the bad pieces of intelligence and said, these are the things that we're going to start turning into talking points. These are the things that we're going to use to justify this war. And these forged documents were one of them. It doesn't matter even if I forged the documents.
Bob, I would have to disagree with that. To me, as a former intelligence professional, I would say there is a huge magnitude of difference between having information that you are going to go with and it might be a bit sketchy and, you might have some doubts about it, than actually forging information or fabricating information and feeding it into the highest levels of the U.S. government to start a war.
Absolutely, but we don't know who did that.
No.
We don't know if this was forged by some... as you remember, the forgeries were horrible, and it was a Laurel and Hardy forgery.
Right.
So this was not exactly some masterpiece of disinformation. It could have been done. In fact, people told me early on in this that it was done by somebody at the Niger embassy who just wanted to make some money and thought he could make some money selling these bad documents. We don't know who forged them.
Well, Bob, I think that the Niger forgeries are a big deal for a couple of reasons, or the origin of them is really important for a couple of reasons. First of all,
it could be a big deal. We don't know who did it.
What I mean to say is, if it was just an employee at the Niger embassy trying to make a buck, that's not as big of a deal as, say, for example, the people at the American Enterprise Institute sitting around and dreaming them up, and Americans being the ones deliberately lies on the war. And also because this was uranium. This was the nuclear program.
It would be more shocking if Dick Cheney did it in his basement at home, but we don't know who did it.
Right.
But my point is that before we jump to conclusions about who forged these particular bad pieces of intelligence, and it could be anybody, then I go back to what I said earlier, that the Cheney-Rumsfeld cabal, as Wilkerson calls it, created a system that deliberately sought out and used bad intelligence to justify this war.
Right.
That was an act of deliberate decision-making.
Although the problem is they can defend themselves by saying, well, you just don't agree with our policy, whereas these forgeries we might be able to get some neocons locked up for.
Well, no, because there's lots of... Well, okay, only if the neocons forged the documents.
Right.
So we're going in circles here. We don't know who forged them and who didn't forge. But the point is, what's criminal activity and what's bad policy, those are two different things. But then there is a number of, potentially criminal actions that Fitzgerald could, if he wanted to, expand his investigation to include.
The smaller crimes within the bigger crime of lying us into war.
That's right. That's right.
Now, Phil, you're a former CIA guy and a former covert operations guy, right? Not just a desk analyst.
Right.
Tell me, you guys are tough guys. You hide behind trees and slit people's throats. Well, how come you guys weren't happy with this war in Iraq? Everybody, big part of the population of the country was for it. We're expanding the war on terror. Why is it that these neoconservatives wanted this war so bad and the CIA guys did not?
Well, it's basically because I think anybody who was well informed, as Bob has said, in the lead up to the war, knew that a lot of the information was bogus, was nonsense, and a lot of the analysis that was being applied to the information was nonsense. And so I think the closer you were to the process, the more likely you were to be saying, "Hey, why are we doing this? Why are we going down this road?" I think that's where it comes from. Right.
All right. Now, and to the as much as we can deduce the motivation of the neoconservatives, all the information seems to point to loyalty to Israel as their number one motivation. Bob, would you agree with that?
Well, no. I mean, I think the loyalty to Israel is a part of the story, but I think that there's much bigger stuff at work too. They had the idea that we needed some great and strong demonstration of American power to intimidate the Middle East and the rest of the world into acknowledging that America was the premier world power. And that was the underpinnings of that new national security document that came out of the Pentagon in 2002. And there was similarly a great focus on establishing the United States as sort of the bully in the world in relationship especially to Russia and China and potential conflicts down the road with those big powers in the areas of the world that are up for grabs, especially in the Middle East where all the oil is. There were a lot of people who felt that arms control and weapons of mass destruction was overriding issue, so they supported the war and were recruited into this sort of bad idea of attacking Iraq. And then there were people who were, certainly partisans of Israel. But I have to say that what I know about Israel is that most people in Israel, even in the intelligence services in Israel, felt that Iran was a much bigger threat to Israel and felt that Iraq was contained. And it was more the people in Ariel Sharon's inner circle and some of the people around Netanyahu on the even further right of Israel who believed that going to war with Iraq was the right thing to do. So I think the Israeli establishment was probably not in support of this war just the way much of Western Europe was not. So it's complicated. I don't think it's a good idea to simplify these things into kind of narrow categories of who favored what. There were people on all sides of this in every country in the world, whether it was Italy or the United States or Israel or you name it.
Well, and concerning Ariel Sharon's personal circle, you've written that he actually set up a rump intelligence unit to produce faulty intelligence, Iraq WMD intelligence in English for shipping straight to the Office of Special Plans.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question that people around Sharon were in favor of this war and took part in the propaganda for it. But in that same piece that you're citing, I think I wrote that a lot of the people in the rest of the Mossad, for instance, the reason Sharon had to create this unit in his office is exactly the same reason that Doug Feith had to create the Office of Special Plans, because the American intelligence establishment did not want to go along with this. And the same thing, I think, is true of the Israeli intelligence establishment. They were just as much skeptical. And so there's there's factional things going on here, both in Israel and in the United States, that you have to take into account.
Right. Well, and David Wurmser, who apparently is one of the guys, according to Raw Story, who has decided to testify for the state in the Fitzgerald-Libby case, he was one of the primary authors of a paper for Netanyahu in '96 called A Clean Break that focused on removing Saddam Hussein from power as a step to intimidating Syria, right? And
that's correct. Wurmser and Richard Pearl and his wife, Mayrav Wurmser, and I think 4 or 5 other people were involved in that.
And Doug Feith himself, I believe, too, right? And I don't know. I'm really curious to this point. I don't know whether you guys have any information about this or anything, but I wonder what you think is going on with George Bush himself these days, whether he's still communicating with Cheney, whether he feels betrayed by these guys and used, or whether he's kind of part of the game all along and doesn't mind. Or, I mean, they basically sent him out in front of the whole country in the State of the Union address to tell us bald-faced lies, didn't they?
Well, pretty much, but I think that I think that you would have to credit with George Bush with more imagination than he has to say that he's deviating from his normal mode of behavior, which means basically Cheney is his closest advisor, and that's and Karl Rove, of course, too. And I think that's still the pattern. There are reports I'm sure Bob has seen in the press in Washington about how Bush, his temper is getting rather frayed, and he's lashing out at other people working in the White House quite a bit now, and he obviously seems to be very unsettled.
Yeah, I agree with that. Although I also agree, as Phil said, that I don't think this is a president with much grasp of even the broadest concepts of foreign policy. If I had to guess, I think that Bush went along with this when Cheney and Rumsfeld came to him with this idea, because first of all, Saddam Hussein tried to kill my daddy, as Bush said, which in fact isn't even true.
Right.
And second, because he probably has some biblical justification for this, having to do with, some preacher who told him that Saddam was the Antichrist and was rebuilding Babylon or something like that. And so there was some, perverted Christian notion that, we had to fight the Antichrist or something like that.
So he probably doesn't feel too used. He was shopping for a bill of goods, and they sold him one, and everybody's happy with each other's role in the game.
Sure. You remember on September 10th, 2001, Bush's polls were about where they are now. And he was in the midst of a collapsing presidency. Everything had gone wrong for him. And on September 12th, 2001, he was up into the 80s or 90s in his polls. So I think that he and Rove both glommed onto this and figured, we're going to ride this, I'm Mr. Tough Guy stance for the rest of my presidency. And that's about as far, I think, as their creativity goes. Rove himself is neither an ideologue nor a great foreign policy expert. He's a Texas direct mail guru. So, neither Rove nor Bush know the difference between Iraq and Iran, as far as I'm concerned.
Right, which is really the danger, right, Phil? Because they end up just turning this whole thing over to Scooter Libby and Paul Wolfowitz to run it.
Yeah, well, that's true. And also to pick up on what Bob was saying before about the Israel issue, every neocon, I'm talking about the actual neocons, is kind of a litmus test. They have to be apparatchiks for Ariel Sharon's Israel. But that doesn't mean that that's the sole thing that motivates them or drives them. They have a lot of other agendas. And to make another comparison, I know the Israeli intelligence service right now has been advising Washington to go slow on Syria because to do anything destabilizing against Syria, it would be a very, very bad idea. But that in no way is impeding the neocons who clearly want to take it on.
Right. In fact, Jim Loeb just wrote an article a couple of weeks ago where we got to put all our faith in Condoleezza Rice now. Apparently, the neocons were pushing really hard for extended strikes into Syria a few weeks back, and it was Rice that put her foot down and didn't let them do it. I hate to think that she's the brake on this thing, but I guess that's what we're left with, right?
I guess so.
All right, everybody, we'll be back. in just a minute to wrap up with Philip Giraldi and Bob Dreyfuss on the Weekend Interview Show. All right, my friends, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. Wrapping up with Philip Giraldi from the American Conservative magazine. He's got a new piece up there on the American Conservative's website right now called Forging the Case for War. And also talking with Bob Dreyfuss from the American Prospect, Tom Paine, Rolling Stone, The Nation, etc. He's got an article out right now called Keep Investigating, Fitz. And also, I got to recommend to you Bob's articles, The Lie Factory that he wrote with Jason Vest for Mother Jones, More Missing Intelligence and Agents of Influence for The Nation. All excellent articles. And in the last few minutes here, and we're almost out of time, guys, so we probably won't be able to get too much done here, but if I can make a little segue into Iran, as you brought up, Bob, Iran is really the biggest concern of most of the intelligence professionals in Israel. And as a funny little segue, it seems that when Michael Ledeen was going to Rome to have all these meetings right around the time that these forgeries were circulating, he brought with him Larry Franklin, who's pled guilty to passing secrets to the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee, and who was an Iran policy expert. Apparently the secrets he was passing to Israel were about the future of America's Iran policy. Now, Phil, you wrote an article in the American Conservative that caused so much controversy about Stratcom drawing up plans for full-scale air war against Iran in the case of another terrorist attack. And basically, I just wonder if I can get kind of you guys' gut instincts on where you think the future of America's Iran policy is headed at this point. Start with you, Phil. Are you there? Phil Giraldi? Okay, Bob, how about you?
Yeah,
I guess we lost Phil there.
Well, gosh, I mean, I don't know if anybody can predict exactly where we're going. I think, on the one hand, it's clearly an unstable and dangerous regime, and this latest thing from the president of Iran talking about wiping Israel off the map, basically shows that the people who run this country are lunatics. On the other hand, I don't think we have either the international credibility or the military power to do much about it. So I think our solution to Iran, has got to be some sort of political diplomatic solution, one that follows along the path that the Western European countries have taken in trying to negotiate with these guys. I doubt very much that we can convince them not to pursue nuclear weapons. On the other hand, they seem to be at least 5 to 7 years or more away from actually developing a weapon. So we have some breathing room before Iran becomes, seriously dangerous. So,
well, we've just really strengthened their position in Iraq, haven't we? Basically turned over the southern portion of Iraq to the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution.
Oh, well, there's no question that Iran is a huge winner. I mean, I think the Iranian Ayatollahs were sitting back laughing as we went in and got rid of their worst enemy. And so...
In fact, we know now that Chalabi was getting paid by them that was where some of the phony information was coming from, right?
Yeah, but I think we knew that at the time, too. I mean, Chalabi had an office in Tehran that the United States was funding.
Oh, really? In Tehran?
Yeah, sure. I mean, he and a lot of his allies in the Iraqi National Congress, including the two main Shiite religious parties, were based in Iran, and so I mean, this wasn't a shock, that they had these Iranian connections. At least not the people who were following this really carefully at the time. And I think
it's just a means to an end.
Yeah, I mean, I talked to people around Chalabi and the Iraqi National Congress back in 2002, before the war, and they said that they had the support of the Iranian hardliners.
I'm sorry, Bob. We got to cut it there. Yep. We're all out of time. Thanks very much, Bob. Appreciate it. And to Phil Giraldi, too. I don't know if we ever got you back. If you can hear me, thanks for your time today, sir. And we'll be right back, everybody, to talk with Scott Horton.